So let me just start out with a little story about the New York Yankees, the great catcher for the New York Yankees, Yogi Berra. He once said that it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And that's really the theme of the talk that I prepared. And I'm really thankful for the first two speakers because they really set me up, because you'll see that those themes, the themes of not believing what the experts tell you, that they often are wrong, especially when they say that something is impossible, right? Don't trust the expert. And also the very importance of instruments, and you'll see that this comes out in a very big way. And I'm going to pick a single problem to tell you about. So there was a Go game between a computer, AlphaGo, and EasyDoll, who was a South Korean Go champion. Now, how many people here followed that? Any Go players in the audience? Okay, well, Go is a very, very ancient game, very difficult. It's played on a board with these little pieces, and the idea is to get as much territory as possible. And it's very subtle because it involves both tactics and strategy. Tactics locally, where you put your little piece in order to surround the enemy, but strategically, how to figure out what's going on around the whole board, because at the end of the game, it's very important how it plays out at the end. Now, EasyDoll was overconfident. He went into this knowing that there had been no Go computer game that had ever come close to beating what was the equivalent of a grandmaster, a 12 or 9 Dan player, certainly not a Go champion. He lost the first 3 games in a row and lost the 3 out of 5 match. And what I want to do is open the hood and tell you how that happened. It was actually a program that was developed by DeepMind, a company in London that's headed by a neuroscientist, Demis Hassabis, a card-carrying neuroscientist who had this idea that by using what we understand about how the brain functions, we can build a program that behaves like a brain, but can overcome some of its limitations. So the key to how this program was able to reach human and superhuman levels of performance goes back to a very ancient part of the brain. In fact, it's part of all vertebrate brains. It's the dopamine system, and in fact, the center for classical conditioning that is found in all invertebrate brains. And so the idea here is that we have a very simple reinforcer that tells us about things, predicts the future rewards. These dopamine neurons in the brainstem project very broadly throughout the entire cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia just beneath it. These are 2 very important parts of the brain: the knowledge store, everything you know about the world, your sensory perceptions, planning in the prefrontal cortex. That's all done by 100 billion neurons throughout the cortical mantle. They all project down to the basal ganglia just beneath it. Much less known, but incredibly important for making decisions and taking actions and computing the value of a particular action. The dopamine neurons are signaling something that is absolutely essential to improving performance, and it's called the reward prediction error. Very simple, but it turns out to be a very powerful algorithm. If you get a reward, more reward than you expect for an action, then the dopamine neurons transiently elevate their firing rate, saying, wow, whatever you did was really good, do it again. But if you get less reward, if you're disappointed, the dopamine neurons lower their firing rate. They stop firing for a while, and they say, bad move, don't do that again. And really what they're computing is potential for all future rewards into the distant future, discounted. Something that now has become really big in economics, neuroeconomics. And that reinforcement learning theory is basically been studied by psychologists and biologists for many decades. They call it classical conditioning. It's when you pair a sensory stimulus like a bell with a food reward, and then you begin to associate the bell with the reward. Very simple paradigm. But we'll see, it actually allows you to solve a problem which is a very difficult one, which is how do I go and make a sequence of decisions to get the reward? Not just the last decision, hearing the bell, but how do I get to the point where I can hear the bell? I may have to make many decisions to get there. And in fact, you've had to make many decisions to get here in your life. Your decision to go to a certain school, your decision to learn a certain subject, right? That all those things were preparatory for where you are now. Well, here's a very simple version of that, what we think is actually going on in your brain, and it's what was used by AlphaGo. A simple problem. There's a little corridor here, and in order to be able to get the reward, you've got to figure out that you go to the end, you turn right, and then you go down here. Now, at the beginning, you're just randomly moving back and forth, but eventually, you build up what's called a value function. The value function tells you what's the value of a move. If I'm here, it's much more valuable to move to the right than to the left. And you just sample all the different possibilities, and you build up this value function. So now, by simply going down the gradient of value, increasing to the right, you will then find yourself to the goal. You'll become very good at doing it automatically. You don't have to think about it anymore. This value function is what we build up through experience over years and years of rewards and failures. Now, how do you compute the value function? Well, back in the 80s, we developed these very simple neural networks that took inputs and through learning produced an output. In this case, this would be the little arena, the locations, and this would be the one of these units would be the value of that location. And through many, many trials where you're finding out something about the value of that going in that direction, you eventually learn how to solve the problem. Now, back in the 80s, we could only deal with networks that had one layer of hidden units, and that's all changed because computing has gotten so much faster, by a factor of 1 million over the last 30 years. And just to show you, however, how this reinforcement learning algorithm can actually solve a difficult problem. This was a problem that Jerry Tesaro, a former postdoc, applied this algorithm to, temporal difference learning, to the game of backgammon. It's a very popular game. How many people here have played backgammon? Okay, there's a few of you. I'm not going to explain the game except to say that there's strategies. It's basically a race to the finish, and you have to go through the enemy. Very subtle decisions have to be made about setting up a blocking position and when do you run for it. In any case, Jerry applied temporal difference learning and had the program play itself. And this is a very crucial thing, because if it played humans, it would never be as good as that human, because the human is the teacher. So by playing itself, in principle, it can get better and better and better. It's not limited by the teacher. There is no teacher. It's teaching itself. Well, after playing a few 100,000 games, he was at IBM T.J. Watson, it got better than he was. He had no idea how good it was, so he asked Bob Roberti, who's written books about backgammon, to come and play it. And as you can see, it played 50 games and was losing about 1/4 point per game, which is actually against a really good, strong backgammon player is pretty good. In fact, he said, this is really the best computer program I've ever played. And some of the moves, he took notes and he went back and showed that even though no human would have made that move, it was actually the better move. It had created a new strategy. And others had been hearing about this and came and by this point it had gotten up to 800,000 games, and you can see it was getting better and better and better. And finally, after more than 1.5 million games, Roberti came back and it played him to a standstill. And he said, at that point, this could well have beat the world champion. Now, this is a relatively simple game. There's an element of chance in it. You have to throw the dice to decide to go forward. But it indicated this is a new form of artificial intelligence because it was learning through experience rather than being programmed by an engineer, which is the tradition in AI based on symbol processing and rule-based. Somebody has to create the rules. Here, it's creating its own rules. Now, here's an expert. This is 1971. Noam Chomsky wrote a very influential essay in New York Review of Books. And it destroyed behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, right? In the 60s, he had shown that you could train rats and pigeons to do pretty amazing things, like peck at a picture if there's a human in it, right? But what Noam Chomsky wrote, he was a brilliant orator and a brilliant rhetorician, basically came to the conclusion at the end of his essay that behaviorism really is a dead end, and that he could not imagine in any way that this simple reinforcement learning could achieve performance at the level of language. And everybody believed him in cognitive science and psychology, and they went like lemmings off a cliff for the traditional symbol processing rule-based approach. Okay, where are we today? Now, AlphaGo had something else going for it, which was something called deep learning. Deep learning is based on what we know about the visual system, the cortical layers in the hierarchy. And it starts with Hubel and Wiesel's classic work in '62, when they showed that, unlike earlier stages in the retina, where cells respond to little spots of light, in the visual cortex, they respond to linear features, like edges and bars, of different cells prefer different orientations, and it's spread out over the entire visual field so that there's a tiling. Now, in addition to these simple cells that had regions that were excitatory, inhibitory, there were complex cells that would produce a response no matter whether the bar was located here or here or here. It was generalizing across space. It was doing an invariance calculation. Now, in addition to these pyramidal cells that you can see here, single unit recordings, there are also inhibitory cells that produce feedback inhibition that keep the activity in a column of neurons within a certain dynamic range. So let's see how far. And then finally, there are nonlinearities as really critical in the brain. These neurons have a threshold below which there's no output, and then it rises gradually up to a maximum. So this is the basic ingredients that go into the deep learning algorithm. And in addition, as you can see here, we now know there are, starting from the retina, there are 12 layers in the hierarchy, 24 different distinct visual topographic maps of the visual world in the cortex, highly interconnected, as you can see in this Van Esten diagram. And that turns out also to be an important ingredient. One layer of hidden units can only take you so far, but once you reach up into the higher levels of this hierarchy, the features that the cells respond to get more and more abstract. They respond, for example, instead of little edges, they respond to faces. Or they'll respond to a very complex scene, not just a single object, but several objects. So here is what a deep learning architecture looks like. It basically reproduces the architecture of the visual system. In the first layer, there are these feature detectors that have a limited region of the field that they respond to, but this is tiled in the sense that it's repeated over and over again, and that's called a convolution in the mathematical realm. And these, in fact, are called convolutional networks. And now that is repeated layer after layer after layer with simple cells and complex cells. This is called pooling, and then nonlinearities between the layers. And finally, when you get to the very end, you have all-to-all connections, and then you categorize it at the very end in a very high-dimensional space, hundreds of thousands of dimensions, where different objects are different parts of the space that have been separated by virtue of supervised learning. So this is what beat EasyDoll. They had a deep learning network that looked at the board and kept track of how well each particular orientation of the board, configuration of the board, was it good or bad? And it learned by playing itself. That's the reinforcement learning algorithm. Now here's the beauty. Because computers are so fast, it could play hundreds of millions of games. And in fact, when they challenged EasyDoll, they didn't know how good it was because they didn't have any human that could play it at that level. And so it was really a shock to many, especially in Asia, where this is a really big game. I think some of you probably know, in China. It's a very, very, and EasyDoll is considered kind of a rock star in Korea. That this was like a blow to humanity, that this could be done. This is such a very, very complex game. There's more. And so, fortunately for us, EasyDoll won the fourth game, but lost the fifth. So at least, we were still in the game here. Okay, I'm going to end with just saying that this story that I just told you is being recapitulated in many, many spheres at this very moment. And I want to just give a little brief introduction to a few of the examples. This is Sebastian Thrun. In 2005, this little car here that was instrumented with sensors, one the DARPA Grand Challenge for Autonomous Vehicles. So this little car was able to drive 200 miles over the desert and got to the finish line before many, many other competitors that were based on engineering practice, especially big trucks filled with supercomputers. This little vehicle here was using learning. It used the very same algorithms that was used by AlphaGo. The difference was that instead of programming it, Sebastian drove this for thousands of miles through the desert. He didn't know until the very end, the beginning of the race, what the actual route would have to be. They were downloading it literally moments before they had to take off. But he just rode through all the different types of roads in the desert, and the car would keep track of how he reacted to different sensory environments. If there's a rock, then he would avoid it. If it was a tumbleweed, he would go through it. And so it figured out from the different signatures what to do under these different circumstances. Now, Sebastian has been the head of Google's driverless car division, which, as you know, has had more than 1 million miles of experience in the San Francisco Bay Area driving a car without human intervention. And it's not just Google now. Apple is in the game. Uber announced that they're going into it. And even the auto companies have realized that they're going to fall behind if they don't start really picking up their pace, because of the fact that this is probably where the future is going. This is a very disruptive technology. We can't even imagine the impact it's going to have. Who could have imagined the impact that the internet was going to have on marketing, Amazon, on music, Spotify, on television, Netflix? Unbelievable changes that are occurring and continuing to change. And here's the problem, going back to Yogi Berra. We can't imagine the future. We're not very good at it. Introduce something new that is disruptive, and it's just going to take a new dimension that we just won't be able to predict, or even when we get there, appreciate. Okay, well, this will be fast. I just want to say that this is accelerating, and it's really quite remarkable. At the last NIPS meeting, in addition to deep learning, there was another network, or a current network, that had working memory that could actually caption images like this. Could come up with an English sentence, a group of people shopping in an outdoor market. Phenomenal that it could do this without knowing anything about language. And so much for Noam Chomsky's argument for ignorance. I can't imagine reinforcement learning creating something as complex as language. He was dead wrong. Don't believe the expert. And finally, this is at the last NIPS meeting, there were 3,800 people who were there, and half of them were being recruited by companies. So you can imagine, with lots of data, this is a very useful way to an algorithm for sorting through it. And so finally, let me just say that predicting the future is very difficult, but there's a lot more complexity in the brain at many different levels of organization that are yet to be exploited. And in 2013, the president at the White House made an announcement that the US was going to have a grand challenge for understanding the brain. And the I and the N in brain, it's an acronym, is innovative neurotechnologies. It's just as Brian said, the key to understanding a complex system like the brain is to develop a new technology that is powerful enough, has the complexity that allows us to understand the real, true significance of all the activity patterns. And that's going to require computers to collect the data and to analyze the data. And so that's it.